Dear conference participants, guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Piret Noorhani, the Chief Archivist of the Museum of Estonians Abroad in Toronto, VEMU, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the conference dedicated to the Finno-Ugric and Indigenous peoples of Canada. VEMU would like first to acknowledge our presence on the land that has been the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Estonians are a small nation, officially not Indigenous people, but we have lived on the shores of the Baltic Sea for more than 10,000 years. In the words of Estonian semiotician and philosopher Valtur Mikita, and I quote, "The land and the spirit of this place is what has shaped us most as a nation," end of quote. We are people of the forest and sea. We still fish, gather wild mushrooms, berries, and herbs, and we fight for the preservation of our forests. We give names to our trees and rocks and know the stories tied to natural places. We have one of the largest folklore collections in the world where these stories are held. We have belonged to Germany, Sweden, Russia, Denmark, and Poland, and have enjoyed independence from 1918 to 1940, and now again since 1991. Today, Estonia is a democratic parliamentary republic with a population of 1.3 million. We are one of the smallest countries in the European Union. Living in the same area for that long would put the ancestors of Estonia as among the oldest permanent inhabitants in Europe. As a nation, we have developed as a result of the mixing of different cultures and people, but it is our custom to define ourselves on the basis of language and culture. And since Estonian belongs to the Finno-Ugric language group, and more precisely to the Baltic Finnic language group, Estonians also classify themselves as a nation among Finno-Ugric and Baltic Finns groups. Culturally and genetically, however, we are more like our neighbors, the Finns, the largest Baltic Finnic nation, but also Latvians, Russians, and Swedes. For historical reasons, we also have many cultural similarities with the Germans. Our cultural and genetic similarities are much smaller with more distant Finno-Ugric and Uralic-speaking relatives, Hungarians, Sami, Selkups, Santi, and others. However, the Finno-Ugric and Baltic Finnic language kinship plays an important role in the identity of all Estonians. We can probably say that the prerequisite for the survival of Estonians as a nation have been, on one hand, the ability to adapt, and on the other hand, the will to adhere to one's customs. We are Europeans who are proud of our Finno-Ugric roots. Here I quote Valtur Mikita again. Estonian women seem to adapt better to the changing world than Estonian men. Our men are more Finno-Ugric and our women more European. Whether, end of the quote, whether this bold statement is correct or not could be a separate topic of the conference, but today it is up to each Estonian to decide. Estonians' relationship to other Finno-Ugric nations is special. The University of Tartu has long been a center for the research and study of Finno-Ugric languages and culture. The connection between Estonians, Finns, and Hungarians with Finno-Ugric groups living in Russia is a unique example of collaboration carried out on academic, cultural, and political levels, and is based on solidarity and the desire to create and uphold the unity of Finno-Ugric peoples. There are universal similarities and also clear differences in the experiences of indigenous peoples around the world who have suffered under colonialism. How do we grapple with the devastating history of these nations and peoples? How do we keep these languages, cultures, and traditions from disappearing? What support is needed to do so? What are some successful survival strategies? 2024 is an important year for Estonia. The small town of Abja-Paluoja in Viljandi County has been chosen as this year's Finno-Ugric capital of culture. Important events dedicated to the unique language and culture of these people are taking place throughout the year, including the 8th World Congress of Finno-Ugric Peoples in Tartu. VEMU-päevad, also known as Finno-Ugrian Days, are celebrated in Estonia throughout October. The Museum of Estonians Abroad is organizing a series of events dedicated to discussing these topics and investigating the experiential commonalities and differences between the Finno-Ugric peoples and the indigenous peoples of North America from September to December. Our first event in this series was with Jaak Roses, who gave a very informative lecture about the current situation of Finno-Ugric peoples in Russia, which can be found on VEMU YouTube channel and will soon also be available in English. VEMU hopes our programming will offer the opportunity for reflection and discussion. It can also be an opportunity to build bridges and initiate collaboration between geographically distant but mentally and spiritually related indigenous cultures. What indigenous peoples need is a question that is often asked also here in Canada. Perhaps it's for their voices to be heard, that their traditions, languages, worldview, and stories are accepted. Estonia has achieved national independence, but the struggle for the preservation of our language and culture and over the interpretation of history is ongoing. Likewise, the Finno-Ugric peoples living in Russia and the indigenous peoples of North America have their own struggles to persevere through. On behalf of all Estonians in Canada, I would like to respectfully thank the indigenous people here, of whose lands Estonia's pre-World War I immigrants and post-World War II refugees established their new homes. Paradoxically, we as colonized nation have found ourselves as colonizers, having subsequently come to these lands of indigenous peoples. Though often not of our own free will, but forced by the dark events in world history, still, as refugees, our people have come. It is our post-colonial past that could help us understand the historical suffering of the indigenous people here and the dilemmas of today, of which, especially over the last summer, we have heard countless tragic stories. Let us then have our voices sound. I'm wishing all of us an exciting and fruitful conference. And for the beginning, I have to announce some changes on the program. In the past 24 hours, we lost two presentations. First, Lara Fitzner was diagnosed with COVID, and she can't join us today, but she's very willing to give a lecture sometime later this fall, most probably in November. And today, this morning, I got a new message from Eric Johnston, our friend from the Spadina Avenue Center, that due to personal reasons, he can't join us. I'm extremely grateful to Indrek Park, who jumped in this morning to save the event. So we Estonians are really very lucky to have experts on all the fields, so that the topics would be covered today mostly by Estonians. But the moderator for today's conference is Professor Andres Kasekamp, Chair of Estonian Studies at University of Toronto. Andres, floor is yours.
Thank you, Piret, for that introduction, and thank you for organizing the whole event and bringing everyone together. It's a very ambitious event. It was a bit of a risk to undertake, as you've experienced this morning with some of the presenters. putting together subjects which usually, well, traditionally haven't been put together before. So this is a very experimental conference. And of course, we're only online, but we'll be able to watch this later on YouTube as well for those who are missing this event. So as the moderator, it's my duty to introduce the speakers and keep an eye on the time. So first of all, in the new amended program, we have Dr. Merli Tamtik, who is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Merli is a graduate of the University of Tartu in Toronto and holds a PhD from the University of Toronto from the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education. Recently, her co-edited book, International Education as Public Policy in Canada, won the Canadian Bureau of International Education Catalyst Award, an impressive achievement, and congratulations. I'm not going to say anything about Merli's presentation because she's got a nice slideshow, and we'll hear from her now.
Thank you, Andres. I'm going to try and pull my PowerPoint up now. All right. Tere päevast kõigile või tere õhtust, olenevalt sellest, kus te meiega täna ühinete. Good afternoon. Tansi, bonjour, shekan. As you heard, my name is Merli Tamtik, and I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education, University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. And I will be speaking today about the role education plays in the processes of self-empowerment and colonization in relation to Indigenous peoples of Canada. And when I say Indigenous peoples of Canada, I mean First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So to begin with, I would like to acknowledge the traditional lands where I work. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. As most of you may know, I am an Estonian, but I'm also a settler here in Canada, benefiting directly from the Treaty 1 lands, which is Winnipeg, where I work. The research project that I'm currently involved in examines the emergence of Indigenous knowledges in education system and particularly in higher education. This area of interest of mine is closely associated with my background. Growing up in the Soviet Estonia, living through the collapse of the Soviet Union, getting my first job in independent Estonia, and later moving to Canada for my graduate studies and academic career. My personal lived experience in Soviet Estonia has allowed me to think more deeply about self-determination, independence, and the role and the impact education has on people's upbringing, and how that has influenced my own academic career in Estonia as well as here in Canada. When thinking about Indigenous peoples and their strive for self-determination, we often forget that education plays a crucial role in it. And in my presentation today, I hope to demonstrate that education can be a powerful mechanism for self-empowerment, self-governance, but also can be a tool for oppression, colonization, and cultural genocide. If Estonians pride themselves of anything, it is their education system. We very closely follow the international rankings and where exactly the University of Tartu places. We're also following the PISA results and taking a strong pride in landing at the top of these rankings. We think of education as an opportunity to develop knowledge that helps to contribute to the success of our people, our nation, well-being of our nation, and getting that training and skills to support the economy in our country. We're also priding ourselves on being able to celebrate the anniversary of our national university, Rahvusülikool, the University of Tartu. We always mention that it was established in 1632, pointing out the long history. We're priding ourselves of this institution that issues degree in our national language. So the University of Tartu can be a very powerful example of education serving as a tool of self-empowerment for a nation. So here is a picture of me being in grade 1, taken in 1981 when Estonia was under the power of Soviet regime. You can find me in the front row, second from the left. As you can see from this picture, education can serve as a powerful political tool. Education can be used as a mechanism to reinforce or transmit certain values, such as patriotism, loyalty to the government in power, national pride. It is done through the curriculum that is approved by the government, using textbooks that are also endorsed by the government. And in order to succeed in life, people have to assimilate and follow these rules. Estonians were actually quite lucky to maintain their schooling in Estonian language, which was not the case for many other Soviet republics. And that has led to a loss of language, loss of culture for many other nations across the former Soviet Union. As such, education can be used as a tool for assimilation, creating obedience, to strengthen the power of some groups over others. As such, knowledge that we're gaining from education in schools is never neutral. What kind of knowledge is perceived to be valid, and how knowledge is created, and who owns knowledge, and what actually counts as a scientific knowledge are all decisions that are associated with power and politics. It is typically the dominant cultural group that asserts what kind of knowledge is valued, what kind of norms we believe in, what kind of values we held dear to, what are some of the behaviors that we all accept. And those norms, values, and behaviors get transmitted through education system. So when we're thinking about indigenous knowledges and the relationship between indigenous knowledges and education system, this has been highly problematic here in Canada, where trust has been lost. Indigenous ways of knowing and making sense of the world have been historically perceived as inferior compared to the Eurocentric Western knowledge. Knowledge that we all value, the Western knowledge, has claims on scientificity, like scientifically objective and neutral knowledge that can be measured. Now, indigenous knowledges come from a different alternative perspectives. The knowledge comes from observations of the land, the environment. Knowledge comes from lived experiences, but it also comes from dreams, spiritual experiences, ceremony, learning from the land, learning from the elders and knowledge keepers. So it is a completely different epistemology and ontology of coming to know. And so this difference has created an alienation and a sense of irrelevance of Indigenous knowledges in a Canadian society, leading into this deficit-based perspectives when it comes to Indigenous peoples. So scholars argue that there has been a denial of non-Western ways of knowing, pointing out that only the Western Eurocentric ways of knowing is the right way to live. And that has led to devaluing Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous ways of knowing, and has also led to the loss of cultural practices, loss of languages as well. So here is a painting by Robert Gary Miller, who was born in the 1950 on the Mohawk Reserve in Brantford, Ontario. And he's a survivor of a residential school system and has used his art as a way of healing from the trauma. So education has been a core pillar in the cultural genocide that has been performed on Indigenous peoples of Canada through this residential school system. There was a political intent to sort of help Indigenous peoples to become civilized. So that was all exercised through government mandated residential schools. We know that those schools were opened in 1880s and the last one closed not that long ago, actually 1996, which is only 25 years ago. Over 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families, scooped up in the 60s, put in the airplane and sent to residential schools, never to return to their families. Their language and cultural traditions were erased. Their names were changed. Cultural practices were not allowed to continue. These children suffered through a horrible physical, sexual, and mental abuse, with approximately 40 to 60% of mortality rate. This is a fact in our history that is known quite well in Canada, but less known on international scale. Only recently, with finding 215 bodies of Indigenous children in a grave on the grounds of the residential schools in Kamloops, BC, has the horrifying genocide committed by the colonial power through education in Canada. This has sank into our consciousness. And those events were really centering around education, reinforcing the idea of education being the core mechanism of civilizing people, yet leading to colonization, oppression, and cultural genocide. While we are mourning the dead, as you know, September 30th is now a statutory holiday, the day of truth, not a holiday, but statutory holiday, a national day of truth and reconciliation, where we commemorate the victims, where we remember the dead, the people who went through the residential school system and died. But what about the survivors? The Indigenous individuals people who are living in Toronto are often seeing on the corner of Bloor and Spadina. These are actually the living survivors of the residential school system, those who are on the street corner. They're the ones who are suffering and living on a daily basis that intergenerational trauma, losing their lands, forcefully removed from their homes, never knowing their parents, never learning their language, ripped from their identity as Indigenous peoples. So having a language, having a land, having a country, these are the privileges that we Estonians, being a small nation, can still enjoy, but Indigenous peoples of Canada cannot. And being here on these lands, we ourselves are part of the problem. I really like the quote by Justin Morris Sinclair, who was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that education got us into this mess and education will get us out too. So also, you know, pointing out the fact that education is a very strong mechanism towards self-determination, autonomy, and freedom. So for Indigenous peoples of Canada, education has been at the forefront of political activism towards self-determination. Many people may not be aware, but there has been a series of documents and policy briefs developed that center around education and culturally relevant education for Indigenous peoples. So I've provided here for you a list of these documents. And just wanting to note that education and the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the federal government are still largely governed by the Indian Act from 1876. Yes, there were a couple of amendments made, but this act was a very strong tool to take political control over assimilating Indigenous peoples. So the Indian Act was the one that kind of provided the platform for residential schools, the policy document that allowed it. Indian Act was the one that helped to create these reserves for Indigenous peoples, taking them away from their lands and kind of resettling them on these reserves, creating land councils, renaming individuals with European names, forbidding First Nations from practicing their traditional religion. Also, accessing university or higher education was allowed only if people gave up their treaty status. So since then, there have been a bunch of documents developed that really focus on the importance of education. So I've listed here a few that probably carry most importance of all of them. So the first one, Wachbunk paper, developed by Manitoba Indian Brotherhood, and which is called now Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. So that document outlines education being the inherent right of First Nations to design and have full authority over curriculum that is informed, that should be informed by First Nations worldviews, laws, and approaches. So the next document from 1972, Indian control over Indian education, this is something probably people are more familiar with, marks another important milestone for the education sector. Again, as this document kind of envisioned education to be a core pillar in self-governance of Indigenous peoples. And the thinking here is that if we/Indians, if we control education, we have hope for our youth of getting back to our cultural ways of knowing and being. Starting from 1990s, several other high-level reports were centering around education, put forward in the relationship between the First Nations and the federal government. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report is one of them that provided a clear set of recommendations how we can move forward in terms of developing culturally relevant programming for First Nations people. First Nation control of First Nation education in 2010 talks about language immersion, creating a holistic approach to curricula, focusing on well-trained and well-paid educators that are working in the schools. Then with the Harper government in 2014, a very controversial Bill C-33 was introduced. So that was an attempt to move away from the Indian Act. Unfortunately, the processes that unfolded when developing this Bill C-33 were still very much in a top-down direction, where the federal government very much controlled the process, even though they allocated over around $2 billion that were attached to that bill. But there was no consultation happening with the First Nations communities. There was no relationship developed. And as a result, the national chief Sean Otleo, whose mom actually was the professor at my faculty of education, University of Manitoba, had to resign as a result. The bill C-33 was shelved, and so we're still back with the Indian Act. A new development and something that has had a strong impact, not only on education, but on other sectors as well, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work. So the commission issued like a summary of their work that took many, many years in 2015 with a list of clear recommendations. So 94 calls to action document. And so that document has been increasingly used now in our public schools, as well as in our higher education institutions as a ground, a foundation in building relationships and reconciling the relationships with Indigenous peoples. As become clear from this overview and the list of these documents, the participation of the federal government, so the political side of everything, it has had a very important influence in the emergence of Indigenous knowledges through education, either supporting it, putting these developments on hold, creating strong resistance, or strengthening the work around the emergence of Indigenous knowledges. So this picture here is a picture of Red River in Winnipeg. And First Nations people recognize the sacredness of water. Water is the giver of all life, and without clean water, all life will perish. So what is our role in the processes of moving forward so that the water keeps flowing in harmony with all people? How can we move forward in the mindset of reconciliation? I often hear people in Canada and also immigrants say that, hey, we didn't take their lands away. We are not responsible. I arrived to Canada much later. Everything has already happened by then. So this is something professor at OISE, University of Toronto, Dr. Eve Tuck, calls a settler move to innocence. So those are some of these examples of strategies or positionings that help to relieve the settlers' guilt and responsibility in relation to Indigenous peoples. Yes, while not carrying the direct responsibility, we're all responsible for making a change today, and think about how we as individuals can help with the processes of healing from this intergenerational trauma. How can we help the situations of Indigenous peoples in Canada today? The focus is on self-determination, self-governance. And as Estonians, we can well understand this feeling of having lost our independence and power to foreign political powers. We need to educate ourselves on the histories. We need to think more deeply about the system that is ingrained with the power and politics and privilege that we as a dominant cultural group can enjoy, but Indigenous peoples can't. Like, think about the ways in which we can decolonize our educational system so that it's equitable and fair to Indigenous peoples. And decolonization really features the struggle of Indigenous peoples for political, intellectual, economic, and cultural self-determination. It is a process rather than a destination, and it involves continuous work from everyone. But most importantly, it involves systemic, structural, and societal change of how we think about Indigenous peoples Indigenous knowledges, and how can we draw attention to these inequities in regards to Indigenous peoples? How can we be better allies to them? There is a need to change the narrative from deficit-based to strength-based perspectives. And we need to focus on the cultural richness that Indigenous peoples of Canada contribute to our society. According to the 2016 census data, we had more than 70 Indigenous languages and more than 600 unique First Nations Indian bands on these lands. This is an incredible richness that we need to safeguard and protect. We also need to publicly recognize and speak about the accomplishments of Indigenous peoples. For example, Indigenous entrepreneurship has started to gain significant momentum in the context of Canadian economic development. And here is the picture of Churchill that has really become a hub, a tourist hub, an extremely attractive tourist destination in Manitoba because of their polar bears and beluga whales and the aurora borealis that I had the luck of seeing when I visited Churchill. Not a well-known fact is that in 2016, Indigenous peoples and their businesses contributed over $32 billion to the Canadian economy, and reaching $100 billion Indigenous economy by 2023 has become a realistic and achievable goal. So since 2010, and more so even after the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report came out, and there has been an openness from the education sector towards Indigenous knowledges. And I want to emphasize that it's not because the universities have become more friendly, but it is because of the strong advocacy work, the ground up work that has been done by Indigenous peoples themselves. So new programmatic developments and culturally relevant curriculum have been introduced, because we know that most Indigenous students are still enrolled at predominantly white institutions and thus relying on a mainstream higher education system. So I wanted to show you quickly some of these examples that talk about or maybe illustrate the attempt for Indigenous knowledges to emerge in education. Here is the picture of Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba that is known for their strong research around Indigenous children in care. As you can see from the architecture of this building, there is an attempt to kind of incorporate Indigenous cultural knowledges into the architectural structures of this building. Many schools and also higher education institutions have now elders in residence programs in place. Here is a picture of Miekma. This is Bald Eagles Lodge right next to the Faculty of Education building at U of M. So Miekma is a place where elders reside, providing cultural support to Indigenous students, because Indigenous students, whether in K-12 system or in higher education system, they are still experiencing racist attacks, racist comments on a daily basis. So this is kind of a hub for the students to go and get their strength in the system that is not structured based on their cultural ways of knowing. So Canada is experiencing an unprecedented surge of Indigenous initiated architecture and landscape design initiatives. So here is another example. So while Indigenous planned and controlled system of higher education in Canada is currently not a reality, but this is an example of one university that is owned and run by First Nations people. So that's First Nations University of Canada in Regina, 2003 was it introduced as a First Nations University of Canada. As you can see, the architecture, there are no round corners. You know, the round buildings fit better in the harmony with the environment. They're more comfortable, more energy efficient, safer, and also the knowledge runs better that way.
The round buildings fit better in the harmony with the environment.
I'm hearing my echo, which is weird, but anyways. I would also like to wrap up by showing a couple of examples of a strong Indigenous women that have taken important leadership positions in university settings, which also speaks to the power of education as a path to empowerment of Indigenous peoples. So in these positions, these women have been able to really affect the decisions around Indigenous peoples in our higher education institutions. So this here, this is Dr. Deborah Saucier. She is the only Indigenous university president and vice chancellor of Vancouver Island University here in Canada. She was appointed in July 2019. She's a Métis woman, very down to earth, raises chickens, is living her best life that way. But being a university president, she has really made a difference in terms of a programming offered at Vancouver Island University, so it's culturally relevant. Here is another set of strong Indigenous women. So from top to bottom, first we have Dr. Catherine Cook, who is a Métis woman, Vice President Indigenous at University of Manitoba. The next is Dr. Jackie Ottman, who is an Anishinaabe Saulteaux, Vice Provost Indigenous at University of Saskatchewan, served for several years, and now starting this year, she's actually the president of the First Nations University of Canada, the picture that I showed you previously. She was appointed in this year. We have Christy Brissett, Vice Provost and Associate Vice President, Indigenous Initiatives at Western University. And we have Dr. Florence Glanfield, who has been appointed in the role of Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research, Métis woman again at University of Alberta. So these are some of the examples of celebrating Indigenous success. While much remains problematic and still a lot of work needs to be done by us as non-Indigenous peoples in our education system, there definitely a strong emergence of Indigenous knowledges in academia. Indigenous knowledges are now perceived as institutional strength. There are an area of institutional strategic importance. Lots of funding is attached to these initiatives, as well as the programmatic developments. I will conclude my presentation sharing this beautiful painting by Norval Morisseau, who was an Indigenous artist from the Anishinaabe First Nation here in Ontario. His painting provides us with a path forward, following it's titled 4 R's, and this is how he sees we should move forward, focusing on respect, working on reciprocity, building relationships, and finally taking responsibility. Aitäh. Thank you for listening. Miigwech.
Thank you, Dr. Tamtik. That was an excellent start for our conference. Gave a wonderful introduction and an overview of the subject, and I particularly liked how you tied in your own background of growing up in Soviet Estonia with the questions of the Indigenous relationship with the settlers in Canada today. We now have an opportunity to pose questions. There are 2 ways to go about this. One could be through the chat function in Zoom, or those of you who are on Zoom now can simply go ahead and directly ask a question of Merli or a comment.
And please raise your hand if you want to ask a question, because your mic is muted. So let us know you want to ask.
Meanwhile, questions are coming in. I just wanted to point out that, interestingly, Piret, you talked about the fact that, women are the ones that are kind of leading the way, and in Estonia, as well as here, as you can see from the examples that I just shared with you, there are a very strong group of female Indigenous women who are kind of leading the way. I also wanted to mention a statistics that is touching upon that. We know that 63% of Indigenous university graduates are women, right? So where are the men?
Well, it does also seem to be the case in Estonian universities that there are more women than men amongst the students.
However, in leadership positions, the balance shifts. It's always often that it's the men who are taking the leadership position, even if there are fewer in the education system. But yeah, I couldn't find a very strong examples on Indigenous men taking a senior leadership positions in the universities, but maybe I need to look closer.
Okay, we have a question here from Johanna to Merli. You talked about the changes of decolonization happening in higher education. Is something enough being done also in basic education?
Yes, well, great question, Johanna. Thank you so much for posing this. Definitely. So in a K-12 system, and I'm more familiar with what's happening in Manitoba, there's definitely a very strong focus on including Indigenous perspectives in the curriculum and teaching in the schooling. What I've also noticed is that there are attempts to develop school divisions or school districts that are completely run by the First Nations communities. So in a similar way, we have Toronto District School System. In Manitoba, we have the First Nations Manitoba School System that has made an agreement with the federal government for financing. So typically how the finance works is that the federal government gives a lump sum to the First Nation community, and then it's the chiefs who decide how the money should be distributed. And education usually falls down the line, is not as important as maybe building an infrastructure, a road to a hospital, for example. So with this, what I wanted to say with this First Nations Manitoba First Nations school district, the money comes directly to the schools for education. There has been new programming in terms of making the curriculum grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing. The focus is on language as well. So there are different programming, not only in that First Nation school district, but also across the public schools. There was also an interesting example that I wanted to share in the Miekma community in Nova Scotia. So it was around 1999 where the Miekma community took really ownership over their schooling through the Miekma Education Act. And there are about 12 member communities and more than 3,000 students involved in that school district. And we know that typically the dropout rates of students, Indigenous students in our mainstream educational system is very, very high. The graduation rates are very low. So as a result of this, the Miekma curriculum that has been used in this community in Nova Scotia, the graduation rate of Indigenous students was 88%. Compared to 25% of First Nation students who graduate from our high schools nationwide. So 88% versus 25% of graduation rate, which shows you and demonstrates how important it is that you have an opportunity to learn your language and get your education in this language. Yeah, that was a long answer, but some insights in terms of what's happening in K-12.
Okay, thank you for that, Merli. Are there any other questions before we turn to our next speaker?
There is a comment from Inga
Yeah.
Eichenbaum, which is wonderful. An Indigenous house is planned at the University of Toronto in Scarborough. Elders and community members are helping to design and program this and activities as well. So yes, thanks Inga for that comment. And I also want to emphasize the importance of having that relationship with Indigenous peoples and let them guide the process, as opposed to, you know, we coming from the power position, taking over and leading these activities. So it's very, very important, this relationship building with the communities, I find, and letting them lead as opposed to we being at the forefront.
Okay, thank you, Merli. Let's move to our next speaker, who kindly joined us at the last moment. But he is really a fantastic expert in his field. It's Dr. Indrek Park, who is a research associate at the Indiana University in Bloomington. But I believe that you're coming to us today from Tartu, right?
Yes, that's right.
And let me say, you're educated at the University of Tartu in ethnology, but you have a PhD in linguistics from Indiana University, and you have done years of field study in North Dakota. You wrote the grammar for the Hidatsa people. You've been active in trying to revitalize the Mandan language. So you are not only a sort of brilliant researcher, but you are doing this very practical, important work in trying to revive and save indigenous cultures. So you have a very wide perspective, and as a linguist and an ethnologist, you also have a fluency in many languages, including ones which you studied earlier in your career, such as Tibetan. So you're a man with a very wide horizon and lots of life experience. So thank you once again for jumping in at the last minute, and we're very eager to hear what you have to say. So the floor is yours, Dr. Park.
It's good to see everybody. Good to acknowledge everyone's existence, presence here. All right. Can you still hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. Well, I'm here in the same room with Eva Toulouse, Madame Toulouse. So we got problems with feedback. So we have to kind of juggle whose computer we are using. Yes, I'd like to acknowledge everyone's presence here again. Good to see you, even if it's just the name. Well, I might experience some trouble speaking in English today, since I just came from South Estonia, where they speak a different language from Estonian. So if there might be people here who don't know that Estonia, by the standards of the United Nations and UNESCO, has 2 languages that are native to Estonian. So Estonian is a macro language. So one people or one nation speaking Estonian and South Estonian, which is the first aberrant form of Baltic Finnic languages, separated first from the common stock. And the language is in deep trouble. There are only 18 families in South Estonia where parents still speak to their children in their native language, even though there are maybe 40 to 50,000 native speakers left. So not so different from North America. Well, let me first start with a little background. In 2002, I went to the United States, to Indiana University, to get my PhD in linguistics. And in 2005, 2006, the winter of 2005, 2006, I first started doing field work, working on native languages in North Dakota and South Dakota, specifically Arekra, Hidatsa, Mandan, later Mandan, and Lakota. Arikara, Mandan, and Hidatsa share the same reservation in North Dakota. Let me first show you the map where they are exactly. Okay. If you see the cursor here, this is the geographic center of North America, the state of North Dakota, which was originally inhabited by 3 native people, the Arikara, the Hidatsa, and the Mandan. By the way, this map here, I'm not terribly happy with this map. This was first compiled by linguists and anthropologists at the Smithsonian. And even when academics tried to be really neutral about presenting original territories for native people all over the world, you can see personal favorites and preferences. So let me enlarge this thing a little bit. You can see this is the state of North Dakota here. And you see a small slither of land, yellow, which was inhabited, according to this map, by Arikara, and north of it, you see Mandan and Hidatsa. And next to them, to the left, you see the Teton Lakota, Sans Arc, Blackfoot, and Hunkpapa, the old Tetons. And to the right, you see Yanktonai. Actually, these people moved to North Dakota only in the late 18th centuries and early 19th century. But most maps are snapshots in time. So for some reason, the government linguists have decided to take this snapshot at around 1870, when the Arikara, Mandan, and Hidatsa were pushed to this really narrow slither of land in the middle of North Dakota, while the rest of their traditional hunting grounds were taken over by other native people. Which brings us to an interesting question: who is indigenous, and what does it mean to be indigenous? So is it a continuum? You are more indigenous in a certain area than somebody else. Let's say if you're a Mandan, you are more indigenous than the Teton, who are more indigenous than white Americans. But we'll get back to this question a little bit later. By the way, why the reason I'm talking right now about identity and language, the reason for that is that the United Nations and UNESCO have declared the next decade, between 2022 and 2032, the International Decade for Indigenous Languages. So this is the time that everybody in the world should learn more about the languages that are spoken natively by indigenous people in their countries all over the world. For most Estonians, language and identity go hand in hand. They are almost inseparable. So for me, when I first went to work in North Dakota in 2006, it was a surprise, to say the least, that language is not the main criterion for what makes you an Arikara, Hidatsa, or Mandan, or Lakota. When I first went to North Dakota, then there were probably about 5 or 6 speakers of Arikara left out of a population of approximately 3,000. And about 3 or 4 Mandan speakers left out of the population of approximately 200, and maybe about 200 Hidatsa speakers left out of the population of about 10,000. I also worked for Red Cloud School on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota for 6 years, being a lead linguist on a project that created the first series of textbooks in a native language in the United States. I outcome of our 6-year project is a series of textbooks that teaches Lakota as a second language in the reservation school system for kids between first grade in elementary school and high school. My experience being involved with creating teaching materials in these schools is that for a lot of people, kids in the school, language really wasn't that important, because they define their identity through other things, such as singing in a drum group, dancing at Powerhouse, traditional the equivalent of Estonian song and dance party, or taking part in traditional ceremonies such as the sweat lodge ceremony. And one can do all this without actually being able to speak their own language. And my experience in the school system was that typically the best learners of native languages were mixed bloods, kids who were half native or even less than half native. While the best, often the worst students were the full bloods, who were usually sitting in the last row because they had nothing else to prove. For them, it was, for everybody, it was clear, obvious anyway that they were Native American. Whereas if you're a mixed blood and you have blue eyes, light hair, people would challenge you in public, saying that, what kind of an Indian are you? Like, look in the mirror. So, and the only way for, one of the ways for such kids to reinforce their identity in public was to respond in a native language. So what constitutes identity on the Northern Plains? I suppose we can ask this question all over the world, not just for Native people in North America, in North Dakota and South Dakota, but also in Estonia. A lot of books have been written about it in Estonia recently. So we can take Estonians as an example. What makes one an Estonian? Is it genes? Genetic heritage? Is it language? Is it shared culture? Is it continuity of certain traditions? Or is it affiliation with a certain territory? And looking at the tribal people, Native people on the Northern Plains, we can see that this can become really an interesting question. In the past 200 years, most Native peoples in the tribal people in the United States have been forcibly removed from their original homelands to either reservations, to the Indian Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma, or some tribes have purchased their own lands, which are far from the original homelands. So often there is almost no continuity between original homelands and where these people live nowadays. What about the genetic heritage? There's been a lot of intermarriage. Most tribes in the United States require that a certain percentage of tribal members' background, blood, comes from the tribe. This is called the blood quantum. This can be as high as more than 50%, 55% for certain tribes in Nevada, to as little as 1/32 for certain tribes in Oklahoma. And since most tribes are really small, over a period of time, intermarriage or with other tribes and non-natives becomes almost a necessity. Take the Menden, Hidatsa, and the Rekora, for example. According to the census of 1900, there were about 200 Mandans and about 370 Rekora and 380 Hidatsa in existence. We are 5 generations removed from this time. And we understand that these 3 tribes experienced a demographic bottleneck 120 years ago. But the consequence of this bottleneck is that almost everybody is related to almost everybody else, which means that the only way to find an eligible spouse is to look outside to different tribes, to non-natives. But that also means that the blood quantum, which for the 3 affiliated tribes, the Mena, Hidatsa, and the Rekora people in North Dakota, has been set for 25%, is harder and harder to reach. I would say that the majority of the members of the 3 affiliated tribes, Mena, Hidatsa, Rekora, are now less than 50% from their own tribes. So given another 2 or 3 generations, it's going to be a problem. So the tribes may actually go legally extinct unless they lower their blood quantum. But this also means that genes, in a way, have become less and less important for a lot of tribal people in the United States. And if one goes to certain reservations, including the reservation where I work at, one will encounter a lot of Native people who are redheaded, almost blonde, blue-eyed, so they don't look nothing or anything like a stereotypical Indian should in our collective mind. Often these kids were brought up in traditional families. Often they were brought up in families where the father, Caucasian father, was not present. So it's not uncommon that the best or the people who have the best knowledge about traditional crafts, stories, and singing, blood-wise, actually more Caucasian than Native. But their upbringing certainly is can be almost entirely Native. I know a few people were brought up by the very traditional grandmas, while they almost never saw their Caucasian fathers or grandfathers. So land, genes, culture. There certainly is a movement in a lot of reservations back towards the traditional culture, where people try to spend time, at least in the summer, living in teepees or in traditional earth lodges. Many tribes have acquired buffalo herds or bison herds. So people go and hunt for buffalo, at least 1 head of buffalo a year, to remember what it used to feel like. People go fishing, berry picking, but it's almost as relevant for survival nowadays as mushroom hunting or berry picking is for Estonians in Estonia. So one doesn't have to do that to survive, and one can be Estonian without going mushroom hunting in Estonia. So one can be Native American in North Dakota without going buffalo hunting. Genes, territory, culture. So culturally, it is often difficult to distinguish Native Americans from mainstream Americans. And finally, some kind of continuity, which is hard to pin down. Is a continuity that is associated with certain locations, families, family traditions, stories, kinship. Probably kinship is one of the most important things. So yeah, certainly continuity and kinship. These things go together. And finally, language. When everything else is so ephemeral, territory, genes, culture. So for an Estonian, an easy answer is, well, if you speak Estonian, you're Estonian. If you don't, then really you're probably of Estonian origin, but it's hard to function in Estonian society if you don't speak the language well, or at least not with a very strong accent. Well, it looks like our focus on language is not as important in North America for a lot of people as it is for us. So for me, identity in the Plain States constitute these four little areas. You have language, you have genes, you have culture, you have territory, and these four areas may come together and form interesting overlapping combinations. And we can see that the combinations can be very different in the 21st century, 20th century, 19th century. So the identity is actually changing all the time in time. And we can say the same thing about Estonians, and probably also about some other Finno-Ugric peoples. Recently, many books have come out in Estonia where by Walter Lang, by N. Tarvel, where they demonstrate, they show the different waves of genes moving into Estonia. And they have demonstrated that being Estonian is not, one cannot reduce it to a certain archaeological culture or to a certain linguistic continuity, or even to a certain racial phenotype. So all these things have been in a continuous flux, and then we are what we are right now is just a snapshot in time, and this is what we are now. And it looks like in the United States, similar things are going on. I would say that the main defining feature of Native American identity, at least in North Dakota and South Dakota right now, is kinship. When I went to the university to study linguistic anthropology in 2002, I thought that kinship was the most boring thing one can find in anthropology. It's been done to death already 100, 150 years ago. God, everybody's read Prober and everybody else. So there is like almost nothing else to discover. And maybe it's true that there is not much left to discover, but the importance of kinship, I think, cannot be overstated in making identities. And kinship can also mean that there are small detectable differences in the way people speak in certain families. This is where dialects come from. What is a dialect? What makes it different from a language? Dialect is what makes us recognize who belongs to us and who is a stranger. So on the reservations also, there is a new variety of English that has developed over the past, I would say, 100 years. So while native languages have slowly faded away, they have been replaced mostly by English, but it's a certain kind of English. It's not the mainstream English. I've tried to emulate it, but I know that I sound like a fake, so I shouldn't really do it while I work on the reservation. Other things that make identity certainly work in North Dakota are certain cultural practices. There aren't that many of them. I would enumerate three here. First of all, powwows and traditional singing. it's interesting to see that all the historical recordings from the 1950s and 60s, almost each tribe had their own way of singing, which I must, my opinion is that over the past 50 or 60 years, it has kind of started to fade away. And for a lot of traditional powwows, you don't even hear music anymore that could be identified as tribal music belonging to a certain or a specific tribe. It has been taken over by a very generalized pan-Indian singing. So what is going on in the United States right now, I'm not so sure about Canada, is that we see the formation of a pan-Indian identity. On Fort Berthold Reservation, where I have mostly worked, there's been a lot of intermarriage between the Manna-Hidatsa and the Rekora people. The Rekora on the one hand and the Manna-Hidatsa on the other hand used to be traditional enemies. But nowadays they are so intermarried and they all share the same language, which is English. And they all sing similar songs that for a lot of young people, when I ask, so what are you? Are you Manna-Hidatsa or Rekora? They all say, well, I'm all three. I'm three affiliated tribes. Bring in some neighboring tribes, the Lakota, the Crow, and we really see the birth of pan-Indian identity in the United States, even if individuals are still legally enrolled in certain specific tribes. So first of all, powwows and music. You can't be really an Indian if you don't go to powwows and don't know certain songs. Well, it's not that extreme. Second thing, participating in traditional ceremonies. There aren't that many of them left. I can make some examples include the sweat lodge ceremony. For a lot of people go into traditional sun dances, naming ceremonies. By the way, a lot of the sweat lodge ceremonies are conducted nowadays in English, and the songs that are sung there are sung often not in the local language, but for example in Lakota, which is almost a liturgical language, has become on the northern plains. The summer on the plains is really a time for ceremonies and ceremonial life. But once school begins in September, there are not that many ceremonies to go to, and people really live waiting for the summer so that they can go again to their sun dances and similar things. So, and finally, I started out with a pan-Indian, the birth of some kind of pan-Indian identity. And while people still remember that the tribe, the grandparents used to be enemies, this is used to be quite slowly fading away, but now I would say that it's really become a memory. And when people get together at powwows, there is so much movement between powwows and between reservations in the summer that almost everybody who participates in the traditional life in the United States in certain areas, in the Northern Plains, in my case here, really knows everybody else. And there is, people do differentiate between who is native and who is not. So there is a larger indigenous identity, which is right now being formed in the United States. It's hard to describe it, but when somebody comes from Europe, these people are not included in it. So it helps when I say that I'm in the United States on a visa. So people say, oh, it's good. You're here as a visitor. You're not here, you're not one of those who took our land away. So it helps me a little bit. But it's interesting to see when the Sami people come to North America, and when they wear their clothes and they sing their songs and they look, they are blonde and they are bluer eyes than my eyes are, and they are accepted and greeted as long lost brothers. So what is it that makes one indigenous? It's a really, really interesting question to me. So when Finno-Ugric people come, when Livonians go to North America, by the way, the European Union recognizes two indigenous peoples. They are the Sami and the Livonian people. And for some reason, the 6 Native American tribes who live in French Guyana, which is a territory of France, not a territory, it's a department. For some reason, they are not recognized as indigenous in Europe. But when Finno-Ugric people go to North America, there are people who are recognized almost immediately by Native Americans as being indigenous too. And then there are others who are not. I had a different idea for my talk today, was about being indigenous, but I decided to scrap it. But anyway, I got back into it. Are Estonians indigenous? Are Finns indigenous? Sami apparently are. What about the Udmurts and the Murray and the Mordvin people? How about the Komi people? The Perm Komi people, Surya Komi people, the Iswa Komi people. The Iswa Komi people travel around, have adopted the Nenets culture. And even though they look pretty Caucasian, I've shown pictures in North America and they are accepted as native. Whereas their linguistic relatives who live just a few hundred miles to the south for some reason are not. So it seems to be in some ways culture. It seems to be being present in a certain territory before anybody else. It seems to be less language in North America for me than I would like. And it certainly doesn't seem to be genes at all anymore. So in conclusion, I remind again of these 4 components for identity that I have identified in North America, in the Northern Plains, and beginning with language, which is more of a, has become more of a formulaic thing. People know how to greet each other. They know how to say a short prayer, but not necessarily carry conversation with each other. Traditional culture, there are vestiges of it. Territory has been often taken away, tribes have removed. And culture, which certainly is not the traditional culture of the 19th century anymore. So I would like to leave this topic with a question: what makes an identity? Why are certain Finno-Ugric people accepted as long lost brothers in North America and others not? Hard to pin down. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Buck, for that fascinating talk. And it was also very systematic, with a strong structure focused on the question of identity and looking at the components of it. And like any good academic talk, you didn't have a clear answer for us, but left the questions hanging in the air. I think most of the audience, like yourself, would have a bias towards the importance of language in identity. That's of course key for Estonians. You left the question also hanging in the air about Estonians being indigenous. You tossed that up in the air, but you didn't provide an answer for that. In the formal sense, of course, they're not. But I think you're suggesting that perhaps this could be somewhat reconsidered.
Yes. Well, what do you mean that in the formal sense they are not? So if you could please identify indigenous for me.
Well, I mean the way that it is done by the United Nations, right? It's and I would think that perhaps being having your own sovereign state with your own language as part of the United Nations puts you at a different level than indigenous.
So this is all negative evidence, but what makes you indigenous? Yeah, well, I have gone through with a very fine comb through the 1987 ILO, International Labour Organization definition, their declaration about the rights of indigenous people. They very conveniently left the concept undefined. 2007, the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous People, same thing. So basically what they all say is that you have to be somewhere before the dominant group moved in. You have to be marginalized. Well, in Estonia, there are groups that qualify. The Setu people, and actually Russia has recognized Setu people who straddle the border between Estonia and Russia as one of the 40, I believe 40, or is it less than that? About 40 korенные народности Севера, the indigenous peoples of the north. So the southernmost of the northern indigenous people in Russia are the Setu people, who Estonians think are part of Estonian people, but the Setu obviously don't agree. By the way, tomorrow is the 100th birth anniversary of the first Setu Congress. So they are meeting tomorrow in Värska. What about Estonians in Ida-Virumaa, the province where they have become a minority? So even though Estonians do have their own nation state, but they have become a minority in large swath of their own country, so do they qualify as indigenous? So there are so many questions. So mostly what the United Nations agree is that you have to be in some ways oppressed, become a minority in your own traditional territory. Very important that you must have been there before any the dominant group who came later.
Okay, we got some clarity on that, not perhaps a definite answer, but I see that Merli has her hand up. Go ahead, Merli.
Sure, yes, thanks. Very informative presentation, Indrek. Thank you so much for sharing this knowledge with us. I was wondering in your research and questioning and problematizing the idea of indigenous identity. Did you ever come across the concept of race at all? Like, how do you deal with the concept of race in indigenous identity as such? Just curious.
All the time, well, that white guy there is not a compliment that you hear on the reservation. And it's, well, I am rather white or light myself, but I have colleagues who are Caucasian, but look rather Mediterranean. So it's interesting to see that sometimes some mixed blood natives call them white guys. So yes, I come across it all the time and I find it fascinating.
I'm not sure. I think Merli
I did not answer that question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the question. That was one of the problems that I brought up. That it's very hard in certain parts of the United States. It's very hard to find full bloods who are really full bloods. They certainly do exist, and then some tribes are more conservative than others. But then when you go to the East Coast, there are when you go to Virginia or Maryland, and there are federally recognized tribes who were recently recognized as such, who are direct descendants, for example, of the Powhatan, one of the first tribes to meet with Jamestown colony. And if you go there by their racial phenotype, I don't know what else to say about it, they don't look any different from us. But certainly in the eyes of the federal government, they have maintained some kind of continuity. So even if they lost the recognition for many decades, many of these tribes have regained it. And as far as I know, there are right now about 300 applications in works with the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Department of the Interior, where they are trying to ascertain if these people who are seeking recognition as Native people in the United States really deserve it, or if they're just some hobbyists who have come together and discovered from the local museum and archives that, Indians used to live here, we're probably their descendants. They're also Black Indians. Intermarriage is not only with Caucasians. Two most recent federally recognized tribes in the Northeast in New York, actually, if you look at them, they are mostly African American. And the reason for that is that there are very clear reasons for that. When these tribes were absorbed by the state of New York, there was, for lack of better term, a surplus of Native women. There were more Native women than men. And then at the same time, there were African Americans who are mostly, there were more males than females. And since they were both marginalized communities, there was a lot of intermarriage. The identities that were taken over by these, after these mixed marriages, the local Native identity prevailed. But you would say nowadays that the race is mostly African American for a casual eye. So these are not certainly academic terms that I'm using here. I'm speaking like a layperson. I have not studied race theory, but I certainly think it's very interesting. And there is also a lot of misunderstandings when you go to big intertribal powwows, like who is the real Indian?
Okay, we have a question from Biret.
Yes, I'm watching Estonian television here in Toronto, of course. And last Monday, there was a very interesting program on ETV2, CTV2, where Kristin Kuutma was talking about the cultural heritage and what UNESCO is doing to preserve cultural heritage of peoples around the world. My question is, are there any cultural traditions which are registered on the list of this intangible heritage in US or in Canada? Do you know?
I am not aware of any such traditions. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, but I'm just unaware of any such traditions. Maybe they've been just too busy, most Native people in the United States, surviving. You know, so they had no reason or time to put in these applications.
Okay.
Maybe Merli knows better.
Okay, but we have a question from Eva, who I believe is sitting in the same room as you are, but it's in a different screen.
No, it's just the view out of the window there. Same room.
This issue of identity, the criteria of identity, because
Eva, you're still on mute.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Okay, let me put my stuff in.
Sorry. I'm very grateful to Indrek for raising the question of identity. And it's important for me because I work on Finno-Ugric peoples. And usually when people look at them from the Estonian point of view, it's very clear language is the criteria for identity. And actually, it's not true for all Finno-Ugric people. It's clearly true for the Western ones, for the ones who have a state. In Hungarian, you have the saying, "A nyelvben él a nemzet," the nation lives in the language. But it ceases to be true in the north and in Siberia, where the concerns of the people about their own identity are more connected to the way of life than to keeping the language. Of course, there is a wish to preserve the language, but it's not as fundamental as it is for Estonians. And often this, I think, biases our understanding of these cultures. So it's very important to really to raise the question, what are the elements which are relevant for identity, and language is not the only one, even for Finno-Ugric peoples.
Indrek, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, the first time I went to Siberia was 1989, and certainly language is not as important for them as it is for us, for a lot of people, our distant relatives. So in that way, it reminds me of the situation in the United States. By the way, just to continue, tie together Eva's comment here and also Melly's question about race. Since we're starting off today our discussion with Native Americans and then moving to the Finno-Ugric people, I want to point out that we are always talking about Finno-Ugric people, even when we go and study Samoyedic people. And I've been 4 times in Siberia, recording and documenting the way of life of Nenets people, who are Samoyedic. And strictly speaking, they are not Finno-Ugric. So the Samoyeds and Finno-Ugric people are Uralic people. So the cover term should be Uralic. Our government-sanctioned organization here that coordinates activities with our linguistic relatives mostly in Russia is called Finno-Ugria, and I kind of resent that name. It should really be not called Finno-Ugria, but Uralic or something like this. And some people have pointed, when I have brought it up, some people have voiced their opinion that when I asked why is it called Finno-Ugrica, why are we talking about Finno-Ugric people, not about Uralic people? And some Uralic languages share more vocabulary with Estonian than the Finno-Ugric Komi people. And the answer was that maybe in the 1920s and 30s, maybe there was some kind of subconscious desire not to be too closely affiliated with people who look too Asian. So that's your answer to race. And I think, I personally think that it's time to move on and give up the term Finno-Ugric, not looking for Finno-Ugric, pan-Finno-Ugric affiliations, but pan-Uralic, where also the Nenets, Enets, Ganas, and Sturko people are included. So our own little issue with possible historical racism here.
Okay,
they lived in tents, and so on.
Yeah. Okay, that was also a very good bridge to the second half of our conference. So the first panels were dealing with North America, and the second section will be dealing with the Finno-Uralic peoples in Northern Eurasia. We've actually come to the end of the first session according to our time schedule. Even though we were missing a speaker, we managed to fill the time, and we could have continued even further, but we're scheduled to have a short coffee break, everyone in their own rooms, in their own kitchens. And Piret, do you want to say something about the organizational side now, before we take the break?
No, just be back at 3 p.m. for Canada and 10 p.m. in Estonia, and you can bring your coffee cups, and let's continue with Uralic people.
Okay, so once again, thank you for two marvelous presentations, Merli and Indrek.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
So back to the conference, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your coffee pause. Some people were chatting in the corridors here and making sort of new friendships and connections, like we do at academic conferences usually when we're in person. So next we will have a recorded presentation rather than a live one, because our presenter is actually in flight at the moment, literally in an airplane. But we will have a presentation which will be shown to us from Dmitry Harak-Zaitsev, who's the chair of the Consultative Committee of the Finno-Ugric Peoples, who's been an expert at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He belongs to the Izore people, the Finno-Ugric people in Russia, and he has been fighting for their rights for decades, and been involved in larger global indigenous issues through various UN and other formats. He's got a PhD in law from Herzen State Pedagogical University in Russia, and he's currently working as a practicing lawyer. So Rasmus, please roll the tape.
Dear colleagues, I'm glad to attend this seminar. Thank you for inviting me. And first of all, I would like to greet you on behalf of Consultative Committee of Finno-Ugric Peoples. And of course, wish you all the best in your cultural cooperation. Turning pages of Finno-Ugric cooperation history is necessary to mention one of the valuable milestones in this long story. This happened almost 30 years ago in December 1992. Next year, we will celebrate the start of Finno-Ugric international movement, which began from the establishment of a new platform for international cooperation between relative nations. 29 years ago, in town of Syktyvkar, Komi Republic in Russian Federation, the first gathering of representatives of Finno-Ugric and Samoyedic peoples took place. It was the first World Congress of Finno-Ugric peoples. The World Congress was established as the representative body of Finno-Ugrian peoples. The first World Congress adopted basic documents for the future movement. First of all, it was a declaration of the basic principles, aims and objectives of cooperation of Finno-Ugric peoples of the world. Let me name just some key points which were formulated in this deed. We, the members of the Finno-Ugric peoples, delegates and participants in the World Congress of Finno-Ugric peoples, based on the realities of our time, to give a historical possibility of realizing the aspirations of our peoples to cooperate, expressing concern about the situation of the Finno-Ugric peoples, respecting the history, culture, language, national dignity, recognizing the responsibility for the development of our people on the basis of their cultures and lifestyles, putting out objective implementation of international standards in the field of the right of peoples to self-identification, rights of indigenous peoples, minorities and human rights, declare the following. World Congress of Finno-Ugric peoples is a forum of the people, which is very important, not dependent on governments and political parties. We intend to carry the will of our people to cooperate and provide mutual assistance in the field of law, economics, environment, social issues, information, education, science and culture. Considering the different constitutions and constitutional systems of our countries and aware of the possibility of different approaches, we are entering the world community to defend the interests of our peoples based on the principles of European humanism and international law. We are convinced that our cooperation will serve the progress of all peoples of the world. There was the first document which stipulated basic orientiers of young Finno-Ugric movement in a new Europe of the beginning of 1990s. In addition, the first Congress made a call to the parliaments and governments of Finno-Ugric states and regions, which reflected main concerns and included proposals. At the same Congress, the Consultative Committee was established. The Consultative Committee is the coordinating body of the World Congress of Finno-Ugrian Peoples and acts in conformity with the internal procedures and rules of international law. The key task of the committee was reflected in the basic deeds as well. It shall defend and protect the rights and interests of Finno-Ugric peoples, as stated in the Declaration of the Fundamental Principles. Starting from 1992, the core principles of the committee's activities have been preserved as follows: the equality of all representatives of peoples, democracy and transparency in discussion and adopting decisions, consensus as the basic principle in adopting decisions. Members of the committee are representatives of peoples who recognize the aims and objectives stated in the declaration. Peoples themselves shall make a decision regarding participation in the work of the Consultative Committee. There is a special procedure how the Finno-Ugrian peoples can enter the Consultative Committee. For example, representatives of Selkup people entered the committee just a few weeks ago for the first time. Leaves or Livonians entered committee at the committee meeting during World Congress in Tartu this year. The Consultative Committee has an equal number of representatives from each of the peoples. The population does not matter. For example, Hungarians has 2 representatives, as Votians or Setor or Karelians or Estonians. Each each nation has 2 representatives. And the Consultative Committee, the members of Consultative Committee, they are elected by the peoples themselves. So Consultative Committee is formed by national NGOs, and in accordance with the principles, governments has no title to nominate members to committee or make any influence on them. Since 1992, 8 congresses took place already in different Finno-Ugric countries, and there are 4, let's say, classical countries which are considered a Finno-Ugric: Russia, Estonia, Hungary, and Finland. And starting from last World Congress, Latvia entered to this scope because, as I mentioned before, Livonians entered the committee. So this year, it was the 8th Congress, which was in Tartu, in Estonia. And it's necessary to mention that last 2 congresses, in Lahti and in Tartu, showed to us, I think to many of us, the necessity of reconsideration of main tasks, or let's say modernization our approaches in the Finno-Ugric movement. First of all, to involve more young people, to attract, to incorporate young generation into Finno-Ugric activities, to make focus on the certain actions, events, projects which should involve at the same time several Finno-Ugric peoples, and of course to find out the best practices and be efficient in these projects and in planning of these events, in choosing these events. To consider also a newborn, let's say newborn non-governmental organizations interested in Finno-Ugric cultural cooperation, because of course from since 1992 there are you can see new and new different national NGOs appeared, and of course we cannot leave them aside, and we also need to work with them and to cooperate with them. Then to develop cross-border communication, not limited by only classical Finno-Ugric states, as I mentioned. So we talked just a couple of weeks ago with the members of Consultative Committee that many of our peoples became trans-border peoples or nations, and we need to take it into account that Finno-Ugrians nowadays live in more than these 4 or 5 countries in Europe, for example. Then we need to work actively at international platforms such as UNESCO, for example, and of course be closer in relations, in cooperations with the ministries of culture, because the basic idea for Finno-Ugric movement is the preservation and support of culture, cultural heritage, and cultural identity. Then we think that it is necessary to popularize our cultural heritage using approach culture outside of politics. This is important, that we don't want to mix culture and politics. Then to use modern technologies to disseminate knowledge on our peoples and cultures. And the last World Congress showed that we can use modern technologies, because in accordance with the restrictions, pandemic restrictions, not everybody can attend personally Congress in Tartu physically, but it was a very good opportunity to participate online on the special platform made by the committee. So we can use this hybrid format, and it was successfully used during the Congress this year. The turning point in this movement was precisely the last Congress, which I already mentioned. And because one of the, let's say, speciality of this Congress was, and it's not a secret, of course, it was the great pressure. This Congress was under the great pressure, and many of the delegates were also under the great pressure. But nevertheless, I should admit that the 8th Congress was organized, managed, and held at the highest level. This Congress successfully confirmed its role in the Finno-Ugric movement and its importance for the cultural cooperation without borders and politics. This is very important. There was no any politics on this last Congress. World Congress accepted recommendations which are an integrative part of the final resolution of the Congress. These recommendations will be a roadmap for the Consultative Committee and for Finno-Ugrians who are also integrated in this movement until the next Congress in 2024 or even further. 2 weeks ago, the updated Consultative Committee gathered in St. Petersburg, Russia, and online, as I mentioned, and it was the first time after the 8th World Congress. Members of 18 Finno-Ugric and Samoyedic peoples gathered for the joint discussion of practical actions to construct the Action Plan 2022. And I should admit that one of the central points of further activities is to move our potential to the so-called grass level, to work more with the peoples at the territories they actually live, to work together with indigenous peoples and involve them in activities and involve the local activists into activities related to the languages, cultural heritage, nature, traditional food system, education, creativity, art, and sustainable development of the territory. For us, 2022 is important here also because the because of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. This is also important that several members of the committee are the members of the group working on the Global Action Plan of International Decade 2022-2032 under the leading of UNESCO. And at the same time, we are working, many of us are working and participating on different levels, of course, and in the region, on the regional levels, on the national levels in our countries. So we are trying to contribute not only to control how these action plans for the decade is going on, but we also making all our best to contribute to this action plan, because many of us are specialists in the revitalization of their languages, so we believe that we can give a really good contribution. And I really believe that this is a big step forward, that several Finno-Ugrians are directly involved into these international processes and movements on the highest levels, and they are all professionals, as I said. And I remember one colleague of mine said to me once, it was a couple years ago, that Finno-Ugrians or Finno-Ugric peoples are marginalized in the world. So there was kind of stereotype. And now I see that probably it was, but however, not anymore. I believe in it that we successfully ruined this stereotype. But also, I would like to share with you some successful information about some successful projects, cooperation projects, and just a few examples of this professional cooperation among Finno-Ugric people. And first, it was the language project which we organized in 2019 within the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and the name of the project is SANA 2019 Civil Society Network for Indigenous Languages. And I'm very proud that UNESCO recognizes this project as one of the best practice of the International Year. The leaders of the team of this project represented several Finno-Ugrian communities: Karelian, Sami, Komi-Permiak, Estonian, Livonian, Seto, and Ingrian. Key outputs of the project include a mini-grant program to support Finno-Ugric language practitioners, activists who would like to implement some innovation or novel initiatives during the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And also the project was focused on the development of interactive online publications, highlighting the work of Finno-Ugric peoples on preserving and revitalizing their languages, including the results of the project supported by mini grant, of course. We received more than 50, almost 60 applications from local communities, individuals, initiative groups from northwest of Russia, Estonia and Latvia, because within this project our focus was on Baltic region and northwest of Russia. So 10 applications received a financial support for the local project, and these local projects were implemented with the methodical assistance of the team members. So we have these regional coordinators and mentors. Most of the projects were physically made in the countryside, so in the villages. All of them were dedicated, of course, to indigenous languages. SANA 2019 team also decided to gather best practices for the preservation and revival of indigenous languages, and some of them already published. Initiatives belong to the most ordinary people: teachers, journalists, social activists, designers, just people who live in the villages. Best practices have become a success story thanks to optimism and activity of the initiators. And these people and we, all of us, we believe in our abilities, and that we are able to support the ideas and support the languages, because it is very important to hear, to listen, and to hear the voices from this grass level, and work together with the local people, because we are the local people as well. As mentioned by the team, just one sentence. We hope that the experience presented in the publication will motivate and inspire language activists around the world to continue the important work on the preservation and revival of native languages. And I really hope that this work was done very well. I'm sure. One of the results of this project is that after 2019, the network, SANA network, is still working and developing by new ideas, projects, and communications among those people who were involved in the project in 2019. Another example of Finno-Ugric cultural cooperation, which I'd like to present, is the long-term project. It's Finno-Ugric Capitals of Culture, and this project has both practical impact and symbolical meaning, which is a really good combination. Project started in 2013, and the first capital, Finno-Ugric Capital of Culture, was selected for 2014, and it was in Udmurt Republic in Russia, the village Begi. And then this marathon started, and then in 2015 this title came to Obenica in Setomaa in Estonia, and then two settlements in Hungary, Iskasenjärv and Veszprém, then Karelian village Vuokiniemi and Chorunja in Republic of Mariel in Russia, and 2020 it was Mishkan. It's Mari village in Republic of Bashkortostan in Russia. This year the capital, this title, and the capital is in Abia Paloja in Mulgiva, Estonia. And already we know already the next cultural Finno-Ugric cultural capital of 2022. It will be Vaiterapa in Udmurt Republic. It's the very south of Udmurt Republic in Russian Federation. So we are supporting this project, and of course this we see and we see how it works on practice. For example, I named several names of these settlements and towns, small towns and villages. But have you heard about these places? Usually, when people hear the title "cultural capital," they imagine Paris, Rome, St. Petersburg, or any other big city with a great history, architectural heritage, comfortable and very developed tourist infrastructure, and so on and so on. But this Finno-Ugric project has another target: to attract attention to the real life, to the real culture of Finno-Ugrians, which we can find only in its natural environment, in this indigenous environment. So I could name many examples of the positive impact which this status of capital brought to each place, because I visited and I have participated in very many events, and I saw many good practices almost in each capital of culture. Just one example: the first capital of culture, Begi, established at that time Big Week, traditional food festival, which became an annual and which became a brand for Udmurt Republic. Obenica in Setomaa founded the Forum of Finno-Ugric Villages. It was a very they established a very good platform for the discussion, for the communications. And it was a few years ago, but still we are thinking and together, and we are working on the projects together with the people we met during this forum of Finno-Ugric villages in Setomaa in Obenica. Vuokaniemi, the village, which is very far away from the main transport network in Karelia, in Republic of Karelia, in Russia, close to the border with Finland. And I see that this village became a new cultural center, the center of Karelian culture, and well known now amongst not only Finno-Ugric peoples, not only in Russia. The cultural capitals are becoming places for communication. This is important, and this gives the impulse to all visitors to cooperate with the colleagues, and such cooperation, due to my experience, is strong and long-term. So this is a few examples and maybe some basic information I would like to share with you. And for me, it is very important that we can continue the communication with participants of your seminar. Unfortunately, I cannot attend your seminar online because I think I will be flying because of the time difference. And now I'm recording this speech for you, and I hope you will find it useful, and we will be keeping in touch. Suurkiitokset kaikille, and tervehdys. So thank you very much. Be healthy, and all the best.
Okay, thank you, Dimitri, and have a good flight, even though you're not hearing us. So there's no chance to ask questions directly from Dimitri, unfortunately. So let us turn to our next speaker, who is Professor Art Lehte from the University of Tartu. He's the professor of ethnology and also the head of the Institute for Cultural Research at the Institute. He has a very distinguished career and belongs to many professional academic organizations in his field. I'll just mention that he's also the editor of the journal Ethnology and Folkloristics. His PhD was on the Finno-Ugric peoples of the north of Russia. Particularly, he's focused on the Komi and the Nenets, but his sort of field of interest is much wider. So it's a real pleasure that he's able to join us here today, even though it's it's not that late in Tartu yet. But Art, we're very eager to hear what you have to say.
Are you sure? Can I share my screen?
Yes, please.
Perhaps I can. So I decided to have a short presentation about this colonial component of this Finno-Ugric ethnography, and share a few thoughts or evidence about it. First thing is that this differences between Finno-Ugric peoples are mentioned or analyzed or presented already in Edward Tyler's work, as he uses really a lot of these Finno-Ugric examples to demonstrate that different peoples are on different levels of development. And he also explicitly compares different Finno-Ugric groups. Some of us are nearly or quite touching the savage level, and the others have more or less high ranges of culture. For example, Hungarians and Finns, as Finns can be compared to ancient Greeks and Romans. So these Finno-Ugric peoples were part of this big evolutionary story. And also this early Finno-Ugric ethnography, it took over these evolutionary ideas. And János Janko, who was the first director of the Hungarian Ethnography Museum, and he traveled in Siberia in 1898 among the Hanti people and collected some evidence about relationship between Hungarians and the Hanti. Actually, Janko also visited Finland in order to be sure that Finns really have similarities with Hungarians and other Finno-Ugrians. He also visited Tartu, and he visited Tartu in order to prove that his idea of this Finno-Ugric triangle is correct. And on the left, you can see Janko's discussion about this triangle model of Finno-Ugrians. As according to him, there are three corner peoples: the Finns, Hungarians, and Hanti, and all the others are somewhere in between. So in Tartu, he established that Estonians are really somewhere in between, not on the highest level, but somewhere close. And he didn't only discuss it, but he actually made the drawing, as you can see on the right, that in the middle there is this very small triangle. And Janko didn't do it actually in his field diary, but he wrote a letter from the field to his colleague and drew this triangle, and it's known as Janko's triangle. But actually it's the same idea as also Tyler presented, but Tyler didn't make this so explicit. And so this idea involves also the view that we have differences according to our level of development. Although we are related, but we are not similar in the way that the Hungarians and Finns are much better than the others. And the Hanti people represents the lowest level what we have. That's the original initial level. It's still represented by the Hanti people. So this triangle is evolutionary one, actually. Okay, and then in the early 20s, we didn't have in Estonia professional ethnographers who could really develop this Estonian National Museum. So we had some Finns here. First arrived this Arne Michael Talgren, who was the professor of archaeology at the University of Tartu. but he also acted as chairman of the Estonian National Museum's committee. And so he explicitly suggested that Estonian National Museum needs Finno-Ugric department. And as you can see in the middle, he claims that this department, among other things, enables obtaining a colony, a scientific colony, where we can work for centuries. And this helps the Estonians as a small nation to feel stimulating and energizing, and we see new perspectives that yeah, perhaps 100 years ago it was a very good thing to have colonies. Everybody wanted these colonies, and this young Estonian state didn't have any colonies, so we had at least a chance to have this scientific colony, the Finno-Ugric areas. Yeah, actually at that time, ethnographers couldn't travel to all Finno-Ugric regions, but at least this ideology was proposed. Later, scholars haven't put this so explicitly that Finno-Ugrians are our colony, but it started from this idea, but it came from Finland, who had done field studies among language relatives for a long time, by the early 20s already. Okay, these were the ideas, interrelated, these evolutionary ideas and some colonial dreams. And Otto's actual practice. So just a couple of examples. Apparently, these Finno-Ugric ethnographers who were supposedly trying to do this great job in studying language relatives, they also were not very polite. For example, Janko, his diary is very honest. He very honestly writes what he's doing, and in every village he tried to get some skulls in the way that he established a graveyard and then tried to dig out the corpse and cut the skulls from corpses. And he wasn't very happy with the locals, who were not very enthusiastic about it. And also he even didn't hide his activity very much. And he needed these skulls in order to prove that we have these racial similarities. So it was quite rough. Later, it wasn't so rough, but still this kind of ethnographic robberies were quite common. And Alexei Peterson was a long time director of the Estonian National Museum, and he considered that it's much better for ethnographic items to be in the museum storage than in the hands of people who misuse these ethnographic items. And so he quite openly robbed these items for the museum in every village. But this wasn't this kind of unique behavior from this Hungarian or Estonian ethnographers. Actually, it was common practice among all museum workers or ethnographers who did such kind of job, who tried to acquire some ethnographic items. It was the methodology of the time, but still it seems odd a little bit nowadays. But at the same time, the same Alexei Peterson, director of the museum, long-time director at the end of 80s, especially, he promoted everywhere among the Finno-Ugric peoples in Russia local cultural values and encourage people to keep their identity and traditions and even to protect their rights publicly. Yeah, I have also participated in such events. It was very common in Russia, even in 90s, that I didn't travel with Peterson, but in other occasions that we arrived to a village, and in the local house of culture an event was arranged, and the ethnographers were supposed to attend the event, and then we were introduced, and we had some lecture encouraging people to keep their traditions. And Peterson did the same, and he went so far at the end of 80s that several complaints were made on his address to Moscow, to the Moscow party, Communist Party, some kind of these high rank offices. And he regularly got some party punishments. And at Soviet time, it was very, very serious business if you got that kind of warnings. As these Russian officials considered us as colonists and themselves as protectors of these Finno-Ugric groups in Russia. And basically it kind of continues. So there is actually this kind of contradiction that these collecting methods were not very polite, that these Finno-Ugric groups in Russia were considered less developed than us, but at the same time, this kind of encouraging of some local cultural processes also took place. So, and just first quote from Karina Lukin indicates that Finns also recognize that this ethnographic Finno-Ugric project is simultaneously national and colonial. Even 10 years before, in the mid-2000s, I read an article of one Finnish museum worker from the Finnish National Museum, and she claimed that there is no way Finns can be considered colonial because they are so small nation, and they simply, because of that, can't make anything looking colonial. But nowadays they already give back these indigenous items to Sami, so they have really changed their mind. But it doesn't happen in Estonia at the moment. That Estonian Museum doesn't consider this potential problem as a serious threat. And so these colonial ideas and these Finno-Ugric indigenous ideology is somehow mixed in the whole enterprise. And from the viewpoint of Moscow, they protect the Finno-Ugrians from us. And we are the ones who try to colonize these areas in one or another way. So perhaps that's it. I have finished.
Okay, thank you, Art. You also illuminated some of the dark sides to the story of Estonia's connections and the connections of our ethnologists with the Finno-Ugric peoples of Russia, which we are not used to hearing, and is important to know. I see that Indrek already has his hand up, so go ahead, Indrek. You're on mute, Indrek.
Now my hand is up. Kas sa saad omal kinni panna see mikrofon? On selge. Kõlar ka? All right. I was actually clapping my hands. Now my hand is up, but I'll take it down. I found it fascinating, some of the things that you shared with us, but I would still object to some of the terms that you use, especially in the case of Estonians. For Finland, sure, I can see colonialism towards the Sami people and Karelians. But in case of Estonians, the only colonialism we can have is towards the Setu and maybe towards the Baltic people. And in respect to what Mr. Peterson used to do in Russia, this is just simple theft or whatever, bullying. I remember him. He was a bit of a bully, right? A domineering personality. So that you cannot generalize it to a whole, I don't know, country, republic back then, and describe it as colonialism. Because when you say colonialism, that kind of entails that you go and colonize someone, or not. What do you say?
Yes, you are right that Peterson was not this kind of typical example, but as he was the director of this huge museum, he had the power to force all the other ethnographers at the museum also to follow this approach, just to collect whatever it takes. And it really happened. He was liked to make surprise visits to field sites. If some group of ethnographers from the museum went to collect items without him, he paid the surprise visit and checked how well they have worked and how many items they have been collected. And usually he wasn't satisfied with the results, and then he simply demonstrated that in the morning he went out and everybody followed him, and he demonstrated how it must be done. And he went to the first house and simply robbed everything he saw. Just told to the housemaster that, okay, you have a radio on the wall. The man says, yes, I have, but I'm listening it. Peterson says, no, we need it for the museum, and simply takes this away. And yeah, but he forced everybody to do it. So it's not only about him. And if they travel to Finno-Ugric areas without him, okay, he couldn't check them during the field trip, but he puts a plan that they must arrive with 100 ethnographic items, or they will be in trouble. So he forced everybody to make this extensive work. But as also Dahlgren, he doesn't mean that we really go to take over the territories. It's some kind of symbolic colonization, or yeah, that we it's perhaps so. And I think in some parts I use this colonization ironically also, that it is somehow ironic that Russia politically considers us a kind of threat and the colonizers, but Russian scholars don't represent any colonial power, but we do. That there is some kind of irony, but they have, because they have more power to define the situation.
Indrek, are you satisfied with that answer?
Not really, but I think he was just a bully. I do remember him when I started my studies in the Department of Ethnology, History and Ethnology, back in 1989. He was still active and there. He was the director of the museum, and I was intimidated. But I see the point.
Do you think that he was the typical? I mean, according to Art, it seems like he was part of this this culture at the time. But do you see him maybe as a typical Soviet type of director? I mean, I noticed that he was in his position for a very long time.
For 58 till 92, so 34 years. Yeah, 58 till 92, I'm fairly certain. No, I don't see him as typical at all. I think he just had a domineering personality, and he was just a bully as a person. He was also a fairly brilliant ethnographer, but his way of operating just is beyond any kind of critique. Well, I can draw parallels. I've seen there is a certain tribe on the Northern Plains where the first person who got the degree in anthropology employed similar methods on the plains, collecting things from his own tribe and also from tribes in the immediate vicinity. Could he be considered a colonial by any definition in the United States? I think it's just personality problems, and it's unfortunate that Mr. Peterson wielded this kind of power at the museum back then. I was afraid of him as an undergraduate. I remember him tried just not to get in his way in the museum.
Yeah, but I was Peterson's last boss as he finished his career as a research fellow at the museum. Okay. And I was the head of department. I fired him. Okay. He didn't talk to me after that whole year. I was the happiest person as he bullied everybody, but not me. Okay. He ignored me. He ignored me the whole year.
But that's the point. I don't think he was typical. I think he was actually an exception. I think he was just a bully, and that's it. And it's unfortunate that he was able to bully his colleagues into acting in the same way. Well, that's it. But I don't think it's colonial.
Okay, let's get away from the personal question of this comrade or gentleman. Art, do you have anything more to add, or do we have something else from the public here? It seems like the public is quiet at the moment. I imagine that some of the people are quite shocked to have heard what you presented, because it probably doesn't confirm their sort of general Estonian kind of romantic view of our ethnographers in the Russian North dealing with our kindred Finno-Ugric peoples. So if there's silence out there, let's move to our final presentation, and we'll also have a general discussion after the final presentation. So there'll be one more opportunity to question or comment our speakers. So now our final presenter is Dr. Toulouse, who has a career spanning both France and Tartu. You're in Tartu now, but you're employed in Paris at INALCO, which is part of the university in Paris, where you have your PhD from, and you're a specialist on Finno-Ugric languages, and you're actually even a member of the Eesti Kirjanike Liit, so the authors union in Estonia, which is very impressive. and it's not surprising because you have also translated numerous works from Estonian, but also Finnish, Hungarian, Finno-Ugric authors into French. So you are a real, not just a sort of scholar, cultural figure, activist who is bringing sort of Western Europe and the Finno-Ugric world together. So I think anyone in the Finno-Ugric business knows and appreciates you. So please go ahead, Eva.
So thank you for your kind words, Andres. So my subject this evening is quite different from the general ones, which have been touched upon this evening about the Finno-Ugric peoples, because I'm focusing on one community, and I'm going to present a sensitive point in this community. It is a culture, which is the religious landscape. I'm a field worker. I love to do field work. I love to be in the field. I love to spend time in the Udmurt villages, and I'm missing this cruelly in the last 2 years. And what I'm going to talk about is actually the result of my field research, of my field experiences, I would say, because I didn't always investigate religion, but I always had my eyes open, and so I could gather information. So I'll now share my screen, and do you see it? Yes, Indrek tells me that he sees it. So I'm going to talk about the Udmurt. The Udmurt, I start with this map, which shows on the one hand the administrative unit where Udmurts, the core territory of the Udmurts, which is this one. You can see it's also behind Indrek's back. And also the location of different groups, ethnographic groups of Udmurts outside this territory. In the Udmurt spiritual life, there are different layers. The first historical fact, which I won't dwell upon, but which is important, is evangelization, which started after the Turkic capital of Kazan was taken in 1552, and Moscow became the head of an empire. In this empire, there were very different peoples, very different religions. And in order to integrate this new territory into an empire, one of the main tools was evangelization. Was first of all to ascertain a presence of orthodoxy on all the territory, but also to bring the populations to embrace orthodoxy. So this was a policy that lasted for roughly two centuries, which was not very successful at the beginning, but finally, around 1740, they found a way to be more efficient than they had been before, and to coerce the populations of the empire into Christianity. This forceful evangelization campaign lasted until the 1770s, when the Russian state's policy, religious policy, changed with Catherine II. almost all Udmurtia population was, all the core territories population by then had been baptized, and apostasy was not allowed. Apostasy was a crime, was criminally punished. So there was nothing to do, and Orthodoxy started playing an important role in the people's lives. This doesn't mean that the previous worldview absolutely disappeared. First of all, you see, especially the green group here, you see that people migrated to places in which the power of the Russian state was much more diluted. These were Muslim regions. And of course, the Muslims were much more reluctant to adopt Christianity than the animists. So by whole villages, Udmurts, and not only Udmurts, Maris coming from this region, and Chuvashs coming from this region, and Mordvinians coming from much western regions, they all migrated to regions in which the state power was less dominant. And their main motivation was to keep their religion. But even where Orthodoxy started dominating at the end of the 18th century, often its features merged with pre-Christian elements, especially in this region, in the blue region, which are the southern Udmurt region. So today we have different forms of religious practice, from what's preconized by the Russian Orthodox Church up to total ignorance of Christianity in these areas. So let us have a look of the different forms it takes. We know that everywhere in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church is active. And in Izhevsk as well, many churches in the capital have been built, in the countryside have been repaired, and there is a church. I'm trying to go on. There is this small church in the center of Izhevsk, quite close to the cathedral, which is on the same, let's say, campus, which is dedicated to religious services in Udmurt language. Actually, the Bible has been translated in Udmurt, one of the few peoples who have a whole Bible translated by this man, Mikhail Atamanov, who is a well-known linguist and folklorist, and also an Orthodox priest. So in this region, in this church, services are in Udmurt. The liturgy has been translated, the songs, the liturgical songs have been translated in Udmurt, and many well-known Udmurt scholars are very active followers of the Orthodox Church. I would mention ethnomusicologist Irina Nuriev and Irina Pshilovodova, the folklorist Galina Shchakova, the linguist Elena Bulacheva. Sometimes they say that they could hold in the church a scientific council. Some churchgoers are dressed in Udmurt traditional dresses, and often the priests go to districts in order to keep their liturgies. The daily paper in Udmurt language, Udmurt Dunye, the Udmurt World, has a regular column about faith, Oskon. This is and the author of all the articles is this man, which is the priest of this Orthodox Church, which is a very, I would say, a very nice priest, just a representative of the Udmurt way of thinking, which is quite mild and tolerant. And he is quite mild and tolerant. He was very interested by our films about the so-called pagan practices in Bashkortostan. But there are all other persons in the Udmurt Orthodox Church, or in the Orthodox Church in Udmurtia, let's say, who are more angry about the Udmurt tradition. Some examples of the presence of orthodoxy and the problems it can provoke. We have here a burial in Orthodox main church. It was an Udmurt Russified family from the Celti district, and they did all according to the Orthodox rules, but Udmurt traditions were present at the moment in which the dead was buried, because according to the Udmurt traditions, they crumbled food on the grave, which is in general strictly forbidden by the Orthodox Church. In some places, as in Tatarstan, in the northwestern part of Tatarstan, in the Kukmor district, there are very clear differences between, let's say, churchgoers and active churchgoers. For example, the graves are differently oriented and the texts are different according to the group to whom they belong. As you see here, a grave in a different direction, oriented differently than others. But today there are not only Orthodox in Russia, everywhere there are also other Christian denominations. So here you have also another example of it. There are also other Christian denominations. There are also Protestants. They are not numerically very strong, but they exist. And they exist even in Udmurt villages, as here in the Vavoj district, the village of Guresh Pudga, where here they are having a summer camp. But here Lutherans are not using the Udmurt language just because the pastor is a Tatar, so he doesn't know Udmurt. We have also Udmurt in the same Kukmor district in Tatarstan. We have met Baptists who are very fundamentalists. They don't watch TV, they don't drink, they don't smoke. And one precise man told us that his wife was a pagan, also, although she is baptized, but she's not a Baptist. Now, Orthodox activities exist also in regions which are not traditionally encompassed by Orthodoxy. For example, in Bashkortostan, which is an Islamic region, but the church has started to build their churches. Until 2016, there was no church in one of the northern districts, no church whatsoever, only mosques. But in 2016, these boxes appeared in ordinary shops in order to gather money for building churches. And the church has been built curiously quite a modest one, quite a small one, very probably from money of the Orthodox Church, and most probably not based on gatherings by money gathering by the population. In the Muslim regions, in the past, especially at the end of the 19th century, there has been proselytism, but a very different proselytism from the Orthodox proselytism, because the Muslims were not supported by the state. They were not supported by armed forces, by soldiers who came in the expeditions leading to forceful conversion. There were simple missionaries who just convinced the people, and some Udmurt went over to Islam. There are some villages, we know these were Udmurt villages in the middle of the 19th century, but by the beginning of the 20th century, they were always Islamized, which means that the people forgot Udmurt. They went over to Tatar, and they now consider themselves as former Udmurts who follow Tatar rules. But we haven't met any of them in our fieldwork. But we know that an Udmurt woman who marries a Tatar must convert to Islam. Although we have also examples of Tatar women married to Udmurts who keep being Muslims, but follow all the Udmurt traditions and rites. It is also well known that Tatars always expect the Udmurts to pray, to have the ceremonies, because it is a truth well acknowledged by everybody that when the Udmurt pray, rain comes. So this is something I've heard myself, just told by many people. The picture is about a village in the Baltachevo district, Kizgambashevo. This is an Udmurt sacred fir, and it is kept by a Tatar woman who at some moment got bored and she decided to quit, but she got sick and she understood that the highest forces did not appreciate her leaving her task undone and took over again. In Udmurtia, most of homes have an icon. We have here two villages. I made a mistake, it's not Barzi, but Varziaci in the Anashi district. That does not mean that the people in these houses are active churchgoers, not at all. There is a presence of Christianity, of Christian symbols as icons, crosses, even sometimes Bibles. But in general, this reflects more of a syncretic approach. So, for example, many Christian holidays merged into the fall calendar and are very present. For example, in spring, the spring day, Yakashka, is held now at the same time as the Orthodox Easter. But the structure of the ritual remains the traditional Udmurt ritual. The name also, but the time coincides with the Orthodox Easter. We have also here a good example of having, it is in Udmurtia, having sacrificial priests, as you see in white. You see the icons in the sacred corner and people gathering, because in many of these holidays, there is a tradition of people going from kin to kin in order to have a prayer, sometimes a song, and go further. So this is a tradition which is still kept. And it happens that even sacrificial priests may come to you on the Easter day and say that Christ has resurrected, but also sing traditional Udmurt songs. So here you have the same kind of activity, which is a mixture of different rituals. Sometimes these syncretic activities may lead to tensions within the communities. And one example is how to behave during funerals. Because the most active believers are convinced that during funerals, one must not sing, one must not make offerings, and it's forbidden to crumble food on the graves, which is the traditional way of feeding the dead with bits of food. One must only pray. And sometimes it's happened that these tensions are actualized within one family. Other discussions which we have witnessed maybe in what direction one should walk when going to the churchyard, because according to the Udmurt traditional beliefs, everything which is connected with the dead, it must be counterclockwise. And other more active Orthodox believers think that it should be clockwise. So these are the kind of tensions one may encounter because of this syncretic approaches. Many people, especially in southern Udmurtia, who are baptized, and this is real for most of my colleagues, Udmurt colleagues, they are baptized, but Orthodox doesn't play an active role in their lives, except that there is a tendency for traditional customs to disappear, especially because of modern way of life and urban way of life, which influences younger generations. So we have here, I mean, some examples connected with the ancestors cult, which is extremely important even for younger Udmurt. Here we have the cemetery in the Karamaspilgag village. Both these ladies were, the one with the green petticoat is alive, but the other died 2 years ago. She was a very well-known and very appreciated singer of traditional Udmurt songs and bearer of Udmurt traditional wisdom. I attended in 2019, I attended the ceremony for 1 year after the death of one of my friends in the village. And here everything was performed according to the general Udmurt tradition, the local Udmurt tradition, and the family Udmurt tradition. And here we have a kind of altar which was put out in the house, and in which all the guests who came for the celebration crumbled food, put food and crumbled food here for the dead and here for the ancestors. And here they poured moonshine or tea or other drinks. And at the end, all this was brought out and people put bits of food into the fire and sang songs that the deceased loved. So this was an example of a totally traditional ceremony today without the slightest reference to Orthodoxy, although they were all baptized people. Another example is this ritual, which is called the Girpit Shoton. It means the giving of a head and legs, which is the last sacrifice made, last commemoration of the dead parents. Some years after the death of a mother or a father, the children organized this sacrifice, in which the main elements are the legs, as you see, and the head of usually a bull for the mother and a horse for the father. Now there are no horses to be got, so usually they give 2 G's, and this is, I would say, more and more active. There has been for some periods in which this was not held, but in the last years there have been many ceremonies, and the people are learning again how to do that. In general, even if some ceremonies are not performed anymore, people know about them. This is an example in the village of Varkidbodia. You see here, you see here the remains of a fence. This was a sacred place, Lud. Ceremonies of Lud have not been performed for the last decades, but the people know about it and respect all the rules connected to a sacred place. And now, so this was here, the sacred place, and now in this area, which is closed, is held initiation of boys. I will talk about later. Other important rituals which are held with a mixture of Orthodox and traditional customs in the seeing off to the army. Today it's only going for 1 year, but formerly, probably when the ritual was established, it was going for 35 years, then it was diminished to 25 years, and later to 3 years in the Soviet period. But still today, it is for young people going to the army. It is a great milestone in their lives, and this is celebrated by the whole village with traditional elements, which are the towel giving, the towel representing the path they were going, the new path they were going to follow, and the nailing of this textile bits to the main beam of the house, which represent the young man. And besides that, there are songs, traditional songs, or variety songs also. This happens today. And of course, also religious songs sang in this situation. Which is certain is that the most preserved rituals here are the examples of the rest of the ritual of seeing a boy off to the army. Certainly all which is connected to the commemoration of the dead is today very much alive. Here we have also the cemetery in Karamaspilga, and one may see the crumbled food on it. Sometimes things are not so clear, but they become clear when you know about the tradition. Here we are in a kitchen, and the housewife died 1 year ago. Every time her daughter-in-law is cooking something nice, she puts out a shot with this homemade, this moonshine, and parts of the food. So the dead person is not forgotten. And I would say that even at my home, when there are young Udmurts coming for lunch, and if something is spilled, they automatically put out a shot and food for the dead, because if I spill something, it means that the dead will want to eat or to drink. So these are the manifestations of syncretism and of further life of Udmurt traditions. Let us have a look at what happens in the regions in which Christianity is practically not present, where the Udmurt religion is maintained. And here, the man sitting here is a sacrificial priest in a village in Bashkortostan. And I remember wondering when I saw in his kitchen this Orthodox calendar. I was surprised, but he was not. He just told me, well, why not? There is one God. And we call it in different ways. We worship him in different ways, but the same one. So where is the problem? He could have had a Muslim calendar, no problem. Everyone has his or her own religion, and it's good, it's fine. We have also ours. So it's a very fundamentally tolerant way of religion. Even a child's baptism doesn't mean that Christianity is, that there is conversion to Christianity. A child's baptism is a way of protecting the child. It's adding protection from another religion, but what the problem? We had an interesting experience with Sacrificial Priest's son, who lives in a town where many Udmurt live, Russified Udmurt. So many Christians, and his wife is a Christian, is an Udmurt, but she's a Christian. And so they have decided among them that she will educate, she will bring up her daughters into Christianity, and he will bring up the boys into the traditional Udmurt religion. So the tasks are very well shared between them. There is another village I would like to mention, which is the village of Bodia. I already showed a picture in which every year before Easter, they hold initiations of young boys and initiations of young girls. After this ceremony, the boys are considered to be men, so they may have ceremonial functions, and they may marry. And the girls will not have ceremonial functions because it's a male religion, but they are allowed to marry, and they are considered as full members of the village community. So here is a picture of the prayer for the initiations of the boys. They have prepared a porridge, they have the porridge in their bowls, and you have here two sacrificial priests who are going to pray silently, and behind the boys all the male population. This was a ritual which was forbidden for females. So I did not attend, but my colleague Nikolai Anisimov was there and could take pictures. And they burn a straw shaft they have built during the day. On the Sunday, Easter Sunday, the girls have their own initiation. They collect as the boys food for the porridge in the morning, and all the population gathers for the prayer at the end of the day. So this is a very important ceremony for these two ceremonies for the population. Even people who do not live anymore in the regions are keen to bring their children to participate to the initiations. And two of the initiated boys told us that they would do the same. They don't imagine living in the village, but they intend to bring their sons and their daughters to the initiation the initiation rituals. So let us go, and this will be the last features, to the region in which the Udmurts call themselves the true Udmurts, Chinudmurtios. True because they did not accept the alien invasion, and they kept their own. So they consider the Udmurt living in Udmurtia as Russian Udmurts. But they are the pure, the right Udmurts. And here you have Sacrificial Priests, an old man who kept alive his village ceremony during 60 years, and he chose his successor. So this young man, which is now the Sacrificial Priest, and this is one of the pictures during one of the prayers where all the people kneel while the Sacrificial Priest prays. This is the closing of the ceremony in which the helpers of the Sacrificial Priests, who are standing in front of everybody, there was a snowstorm at that moment, and just walk around the fireplaces in order to close them. The most spectacular elements in the religious practice of the traditional and the right Udmurts are the collective ceremonies of one or several villages. Some are characterized by continuity, as the previous picture, because here there hasn't been any interruption of the practice during the Soviet period. Here in this group also there is full continuity, but in many villages, as here in Badrin Kachak, there has been a very long interruption. We know everything. We know lots of things about Badrin Kachak from 1885, because Uriel Wichmann was there, and he was there during 1 month, and he wrote about the religious practice in the village. He wrote about the sacred places. We have lots of information. He did pictures. But we don't know anything about this place during the 20th century. We only know that at the beginning of the 90s, they revitalized their ceremonies, but then all the people who remembered something were dead. So they had to find a prayer and to find new sacrificial priests. And well, I have no picture here of the sacrificial priest here. And here the people gather in order to promise a sacrifice. And what is interesting in this place is that females play an important role. It's the only place in Bashkortostan where they are as active as men, as we see here. They are the ones who prepare the porridge. They are the main helpers. And this may provoke tensions during the common ceremonies in which there are people from other villages who come. So here are the the sacrificial priests from 4 villages who pray together. And just to finish, big collective rituals are not the only manifestation of traditional practice in these regions. There are other family rituals which are kept. For example, here, welcoming a newborn, the wedding of a newborn, as it's called in Udmurt, Nunishuan. You see here a black point on the child, and people gather and have a banquet and give money to the newborn. So they give money on clothing of the newborn, and of course traditional food is offered. There is another family ritual, which is the autumn prayer, which is held in families. Here we are with the sacrificial priest and his wife. She prepared the porridge, and now he's taking the porridge outside, and he will pray loudly and come back and offer the porridge to everybody. I mentioned the importance of the cult of the dead. There is a cemetery in the Yanaul district, where people hold commemorative ceremonies with a bull and the legs of 2 geese. So this is an overview of the situation, the religious situation in Udmurt nowadays, and shows, our fieldwork shows that the Udmurt spiritual culture at the beginning of the 21st century is very diverse and a complex ongoing process. It is not isolated from general trends. It receives very different impulses. Some traditions are disappearing, some others are being created and invented. And it is really important, and that's what we endeavor to do, to follow the ongoing process. And so that's what I wanted to talk about this evening. You know, the babushkas from Buranovo.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. Andres had to leave because he has other obligations. We will have an exhibit opening here in Toronto later tonight, and Andres is speaking there. So I will take it over here. First, thank you very much for opening this new aspect of like traditional indigenous peoples living, which is religion. There has been talk about traditions, but I think nobody even mentioned the word religion before, or belief systems. So thanks for that. And it really very well showed how, like in a contemporary world, probably every culture have to find a way how to amalgamate all those different aspects we are dealing with like on daily basis. So it was really very exciting presentation. And floor is open to questions or comments now. I'm pretty sure that Indrek has something to say.
Still gathering thoughts.
Still gathering. Take your time.
Not so much of a question, but just a comment. I've always wondered how the Udmurts, or I suppose it's a question, were able to preserve so much of their pre-Christian traditions while they faced the similar kinds of obstacles and oppression and forces of Russification as the other Finno-Ugric people. But somehow they seem to have managed better. What do you say, Eva?
That's. Am I to be heard?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was looking for this map because what I wanted to show in this map, and it explains a lot, is to find that in Udmurt history, this border part of the Udmurt territory was incorporated in Muscovy much earlier than the other parts. So they were in touch with Orthodox and with the Russians much earlier. The region of Vyatka, nowadays Vyatka, before Khlinov, but later Kirov, was incorporated in 1465, something like that, into Moscow. The other parts of Udmurt, especially the southern regions, remained in the Turkic state, the Khanate of Kazan, until 1552. Say that's a very long time. But the Tatars are just by. They are very close to the Tatars. And I would say that there is a kind of Turkic shield for the Finno-Ugrians living in close vicinity of the Tatars. And this has been an influence which counterbalanced the Russian one. So that many Udmurts feel that elements taken from the Tatar culture are more Udmurt than direct loans from Russian culture. And I think that this close vicinity to the Tatars has been a shield, as it has for the people living in Tatarstan and in Bashkortostan, but mostly in Bashkortostan. Because in Tatarstan, there is also a presence of Christianity, nevertheless. But that's how I understand.
Yeah, it's an interesting picture, actually. Like Indrek talked about, like there is no 100% of pure genes, but there's also no like 100% pure religions anymore. It's all a mixture of this and that and different influences from different times. What are your thoughts on that, Art?
I think if we talk about his animistic beliefs, then it's actually a characteristic feature that it absorbs different things it can see around, and it's kind of principle of animism, that it's not restricted to something that already exists and only that. But I don't know, I suppose some other kind of religions, they still try to reach some kind of purity, and it's hard to tell that everything becomes more mixed.
But I would comment about that, that it depends on what we study. If we study theology, it's sure that there are many things that do not change. Dogmas are very rooted. But if you look at folk religion, very often this, I think the notion of purity is not a good working tool. because folk religion finally absorbs what the people absorb. And that may be in contradiction with official religions, but animists have no official religion. That's one of the reasons why they are very sensitive. And why the Russians choose to evangelize, first of all, animists, because it was much easier than take over Muslims, who had the shield of a very strong dogma also. Animists were easy. And animists did not mind. They just added a layer.
Mm-hmm. But what came out from Eva's presentation is that this animistic tradition, it's very much connected to the village tradition. It's not like something to in urban, big cities, right?
Yes, I agree. And I would say that there is a great difference between the regions, because in Marielle, there is a centralized, institutionalized Mari Viola, Mari religion, which is official religion in Marielle at the moment, one of the, along with Orthodoxy, and which is also a city religion. But in parallel, also in Marielle, there is this spontaneous religious practice in the villages. And at the moment, what we have in Udmurtia, in towns, in Izhevsk, for example, there is a religious practice in Izhevsk I have not investigated yet, but it is much closer to something neo-paganism. While what is going on in the villages is their way of being.
Any other questions, comments? I can't see any raising hands. I have one last question to all the speakers who are still with us, because some have left, and that would be, what would Westerners learn from those so-called non-Western knowledge?
When I answer, it's a thing I say quite often. I think we have much to learn. And what for me is essential is this tolerant approach to religion. And I think this is a very important message for the 21st century people. And I think our lives would be much more pleasant if there were more people who thought like Udmurt sacrificial priests. And I'm mute.
Indrek, what would you say?
What will Westerners learn from Uralic people and Native American people? I think we would have to ask them. That's my answer. I don't know. We would have to ask them.
Mm-hmm. Art, what do you think?
I think it's quite obvious. I think what makes Uralic people and Native American people different from Westerners is being indigenous. And I think most, the term indigenous covers most Uralic people, not all. I'm not gonna, get into more detail here, but I think being indigenous is really the answer for the future, for the fate of the planet, ecology. It means that you're attached to a defined territory and you know all of it. You know if something changes, so you get up in your arms. If you live in a large country, you lose the sense of being indigenous. You can move in a territory like 1,000 kilometers south to north, east to west, and just lose touch with the land and what changes there. And I think that's pretty much the answer to it. Small is beautiful. And it's the answer for the future in many respects.
Thanks. Art, your turn.
I suppose that if we look closer to these peoples and cultures, that in a sense we are all on the same level. As I started my presentation, that first there was this evolutionary idea that some people are higher and some are lower. But it was just a principle. It was invented not because these scholars knew a lot about these indigenous groups, but because they didn't know. But as we can see, actually, among these people, this culture is very very much developed. It has many details and very elaborated ideas. And if we recognize that, we can see that actually all people are on the similar level somehow. That it's perhaps also to this message to this Finno-Ugric or Uralic kind of movement or scholarship. What has changed, that we don't think anymore in these terms, that we are not going to search for our roots, for our relatives who remained on lower level. Okay, for scholars, there is nothing new, that we are on the same level, or there are no levels. But this idea that some people are more primitive than the others, it's still very popular among people, I suppose, in society in general, that this message as these indigenous groups are very well developed culturally. That if we learn more, we can promote this tolerance more as well.
And that's what you helped us to achieve today, because that was our main aim, to just educate people. And I'm really grateful for our Estonian community here in Canada. I've seen that you were the biggest part of the audience. But as we recorded the conference, we will post it to the YouTube, so all the people who couldn't join us today can do it later. Many thanks to our speakers, especially to those who jumped in at the very last moment, and 3 of them are on the screen now here. So my special thanks to Raite. Please follow VEMU's program, because more is coming. There is a museum tour to Estonian National Museums. I think the best exhibit they have there, the eco-furals, Uralikaja. We will have a film screening with Collegium Musicale Choir, and even our Estonian Music Week, that the second day is dedicated to Indigenous people. So follow our program, and more lectures would follow in November and beginning of December. But to finish up this event today, we have prepared a treat for you. We are going to watch and listen the most well-known piece by Veljo Tormis, Raua Needmine, sung by Collegium Musicale, and that's part of the film we are going to watch in 2 weeks. So thanks for being with us. Keep up doing your great work and research, and I will really hope to see you here again in person or on the screens. Aitäh!